The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
It is Wednesday, April 12th, 2017. My name is Sam Seder. This is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, it's one of our vacation shows. I should say, and I neglected to say this on Monday and Tuesday's show, but happy Pesach. I celebrate Passover, and having had two Seders, up with the Cedars. See what I did there? Spelled the same way.
A lot of puns and wordplay.
Oh, yeah, totally. Now I'm hanging out with my kids, doing a little spring vacation thing with them, and an in-law. We don't need to get into that. And what we do around these parts, if you are a new listener, is we provide all new material when we go on vacation. So that really we're just taking a vacation from the live show, not from the daily offering of great interviews that we do. Obviously, we can't keep up with the news when we're on vacation. Frankly, these days, I can barely keep up with it when I'm not on vacation. But for you today, the historian and engineer Henry Petroski discusses his book, The Road Taken, The History and Future of America's Infrastructure. And we were trying to figure out how to place these different shows over the next 3 days. And what we came up with, I mean, tomorrow we're going to be talking to Henry Heller, and by we, I mean me, who is a historian, first and foremost, as opposed to Petroski, who's also an engineer. And on the evolution of capitalism in higher education. It's a fascinating talk. He's a fascinating guy. But he really has also a critique of history or historians. And in some respects, I did that interview first, and then I did the Henry Petroski. And I felt like after the Henry Petroski thing that his critique of historians, you know, none of this stuff is explicit, could apply to this. Because I think, like, Petroski follows the history of infrastructure, but not necessarily the history that was concurrent of it, like all of history at that time, or of the forces on this. And I think, politically speaking, I think he is a little bit more amenable to the private sector and a little bit more skeptical of taxes than I am. And I made that clear just at the end. But it's interesting stuff just to see the development of this. And I actually, I think there's also still another story, too, about our relationship with infrastructure, how it's evolved, and what other things are going on, what's happening sort of in the ideological history simultaneously. And but listen to this today, because there's a lot of stuff that I think you'll find really interesting in it. And then it also, I think, will make, will put a very interesting perspective, set the table in an interesting way tomorrow for Henry Heller. So enjoy this interview. Henry Petroski, The Road Taken, The History and Future of America's Infrastructure. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor Henry Petroski. He is a civil engineering and history professor at Duke University, author of To Engineer is Human, The Essential Engineer, The Pencil, and his latest, The Road Taken, The History and Future of America's Infrastructure. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you.
So let's start with just the concept of infrastructure. I mean, the idea of perceiving infrastructure the way that we discuss it today is a relatively new development, isn't it?
Yes. The word itself is relatively new to the English language, at least. Before, the turn of, I would say, the middle of the 20th century, it was barely used in English at all. Later in the century, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal would often put it in quotes. It took a while before they accepted it as a word that didn't need any qualification. Now, of course, it's a word that's all over the place and used by everyone in every context, usually qualified by the word crumbling.
Right. Well, I mean, do you think because of that qualification, I mean, how did people discuss these things? I mean, has the concept changed, or is it simply that we now have a word for it? And why did it take us so long to have that word enter the vernacular?
Well, we actually did have a word or a phrase for the concept, and that was public works. What we today call infrastructure for a long time was called public works in this country. But public works, the term, got a bad name. It was associated very closely with pork barrel. And it was hard to separate those two concepts. So eventually, when this word infrastructure became available and became faddish, if you will, politicians especially embraced it because it separated the concept from pork barrel spending.
And that was in the 80s, right? I mean, I guess I wonder if it was not just a question of public works was seen as bad, but there was a desire to sort of change the emphasis away from the word public. I mean, that's largely, it seems to me, a lot of what the 80s was about.
Well, that's part of it. Yeah, and that's happening now, too. If you listen to the reports coming out of Washington these days, there's a lot of suggestion that we need private money to help with our infrastructure, public-private partnerships, and other versions of contributions other than through taxes.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder how much that plays into the broader story, and we can talk about that. But let's go back to the development, I think, of what people perceive as one of the biggest infrastructure or public works projects the country has had is the interstate highway system. Tell us a little bit about how that developed.
Well, it's a matter of where we want to start. Let me start by saying that in 1919, the Army wanted to demonstrate its mobility in motorized vehicles, which were still relatively new. So a convoy was formed that was going to go from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And one of the very, very young Army lieutenant colonels was a little young fellow named Dwight David Eisenhower. It took that convoy 2 months to go about 3,000 miles. Today, of course, we can do that same trip on interstate highways in about 3 days if we want to push it. But this made a very big impression on Eisenhower. So when he was in Europe, especially for World War II, and experienced the Autobahn, he wanted to come home and be able to influence how we would maybe in this country build a similar system, or at least a system that would, if not rival, come close to the German Autobahn. Now, the whole idea of an interstate highway system was not new. It wasn't instituted by Eisenhower. There was talk before World War II, well, in fact, during the Depression, of an interregional highway system. But the term interregional was somehow not looked favorably upon. But then the war interrupted any thoughts to really take the idea further. It was not until Eisenhower was elected president in the 1950s that the idea resurfaced. And with his background, with his trips with the convoy across the country on the terrible American roads, in contrast to the wonderful Autobahn that he experienced in Germany, he was all for being all behind an interstate highway system in this country. And what that meant was not build it. Neither he nor the federal government was authorized by the Constitution to build a system of roads or bridges. All the Constitution authorized the federal government to do was to be concerned with post roads along which the mail would be delivered. And that was, of course, an old concept from the 18th century. But nobody in the state highway departments opposed the federal government contributing money. And that's what really ended up being the great impetus for the interstate system as we know it. The federal government was contributing up to 90% of the cost of the roads we know today as the interstates. The state governments, through the state departments of transportation, would contribute the other 10%. Now, that adds up to 100%, but depending on who you talk to in the 1950s and into the 60s, they would say, well, that's only 100%. They're really costing 200% when you add on graft and corruption. And that's always been a problem that's discussed with road building, contracting, and it's something that plagues us to this day. And the fact of the matter is that it's not an imagined thing. There are prosecutions that go on, and if we could eliminate some of that, or a good deal of that, some of the financial deficits that we hear about the infrastructure experiencing might be helped partway, not all way.
I want to talk about how that was coordinated between the different states, but staying on the graft and corruption. I mean, is there, and maybe this is a little bit tangential and maybe outside of your portfolio, but I mean, it seems to me that, and I was just thinking about this the other day, which is why it just occurs to me that there is so much graft and corruption, it seems to me, in just about every single human interaction that involves money on any type of like large scale. I mean, I just, a guy I know told me a story about how oil truck drivers make money on the side by delivering oil to buildings with a super who will take a kickback for taking less oil. Then the truck driver, and saying he got the full amount, truck driver drives around with some extra oil, goes and sells that at a discount to the next guy and pockets the money. I mean, it seems to me that these type of things are somewhat inevitable with any large human endeavor. Or is that...
Well, that is, yes. Sorry, but yes, that's one way of looking at it. It's a cost of doing business for the large companies, for the federal government, and so forth. I guess if you want to be a realist, perhaps you accept it as the cost of doing business, the cost of getting any roads at all. But there are idealists, too, who would rather it weren't as pervasive as it appears to be. And especially when we're talking about so much of a deficit with the Highway Trust Fund, which is where the money comes from the federal government to pay for its contribution to roads and bridges. You know, we all pay gas taxes at the pump. The federal gas tax is 18.4 cents a gallon, and that hasn't changed since 1993. Wow. Even though there's been inflation and, you know, other reasons that it should go up. So by cutting into that, making a cost of doing business to get roads built, it's effectively less than 18.4 cents. Now, of course, we pay a lot more in taxes at the pump. If they used to be posted rather explicitly, I don't see them posted so much anymore. But there are also state taxes. And these days, the state tax in some states can be 3 or 4 times as much as the federal government tax. And the reason for that is that the state governments are the ones that, through their highway departments, actually own and are responsible for the highways. And, if the highways really do literally crumble, it's the state government that is left holding the bag. So they need to somehow fix a road, and they don't have any money, and the federal government doesn't have any money to give them. Well, they'll raise the gasoline tax. That's happening around the country, pretty much in all states these days. They're at least considering making an increase in the gasoline tax, and there are alternative ways of paying for roads that are being considered, that are considered maybe more fair. The federal government has been actually working at cross purposes. They've been encouraging all electric vehicles. They've been encouraging hybrid vehicles. And these kinds of vehicles, of course, either don't use any gasoline or don't use as much as an equivalent internal combustion automobile, which means they're not putting as much money into the highway trust fund because they're not paying as much tax, yet they're doing as much damage to the roads as their equivalent in terms of, the weight of the vehicle.
Is there, how is it that when you're building these, the interstate highways, what role does the federal government have in standardizing, the load capacity of the roads, the signage, all of the things that need to be standardized that we don't really pay attention to as, as the Mass Pike turns into 90, I guess, in New York, or Route 95 takes me, all up and down the eastern seaboard. How does that happen, and to what extent does the federal government have the ability to standardize that thing? Basically, I assume that's the strings that the money comes with.
Well, that's exactly right. And I do think that is the success story of the federal government's involvement, that it does hold the strings and it forces standardization so that when you do cross a state line, you may notice the pavement is a little different. It may be a little bumpier, or it may be a lot bumpier, because you're going into a different state, and that means that there's a different contract that was let to, pave that road. But what's also important in infrastructure, roads in particular, is not just the smoothness of the pavement, but also the standardization of the markings on the side of the road. We all get very used to the markings. We don't even register them consciously after a while, but we know that the yellow line is supposed to be on our left, and if we cross it, we're going into oncoming traffic. If we have a solid right line on our right and we cross it, we know we're going off the shoulder of the road and possibly into muddy ground and hit a tree. All that has been standardized by the federal government and telling the states, well, if you don't do it this way, you're not going to get any money. It's as simple as that. As far as the weights of trucks and vehicles, that is one of the big frustrations that engineers have. If engineers are expected to build a bridge or design a bridge and a road leading up to it, there is a weight that they have in mind. That's how they design. The bridge has to carry a certain weight of truck. And you would think logically that's the heaviest truck that can use the road and therefore the bridge. But state legislatures can make changes in that. I've seen it happen in various states. And what this does, of course, is it ages the bridge prematurely, because every time a very heavy truck goes over a bridge, it does a little more damage to it. And that's why we see here and there bridges with posted weight limit 5 tons or weight limit 20 tons. It's because those bridges, originally they might have been designed for more than that, but now they can't take that much without danger of collapse. There was a case in Maine that I followed closely where a historic suspension bridge was a main link in the Route 1 chain going up the coast, and it deteriorated faster than expected. There was trucks were banned from it for a while, which meant that they had to drive 60 miles out of the way. Well, that's important. That not only means that they take extra time making their delivery, they're on the road longer. The drivers are. The truck has more wear and tear on it because it has to drive longer to accomplish the same delivery schedule, and so forth and so on. So all these little variables have pretty severe implications for not only the infrastructure, but also for the people and the businesses using the infrastructure and relying upon it.
I mean, is there a clear relationship between the value added to the economy, or I think it even goes beyond that, like the economic, broadly speaking, implications of an investment like that? I mean, aside from the first order stuff, right, where I'm going in and we're doing a contract for $20 million, or I'm doing the big dig, for billions of dollars in Boston, and that means that there's going to be a lot of money coming into the economy from the federal government. But I mean, beside the first order stuff, do we have a sense of just how much building an interstate highway system, or just even the concept of building roads on a state level, how much that allows for economic activity?
Well, sure. Let's say a company is thinking about moving into an area. It could be a big box store. It could be a factory. They have to worry about getting their goods delivered, distributed. That takes a road network, and they have to worry about if there's a manufacturing company, they have to worry about getting them out to distribute them the other way. And they want a good road network that's not only going to be fairly smooth riding so that they don't break the eggs, let's say, delivering them to the grocery store, or break some delicate product that is being developed. So a company that is considering relocating or establishing a new store in an area will take that into account in a big way. What is the infrastructure? What access do I have to the broader interstate highway system, for example? And local municipalities, towns, villages even, are very aware of this. They want companies to come in and bring new jobs, so they will actually negotiate with a business, a large firm, or even a not so large firm. Well, build your factory here. You'll bring the jobs. We'll give you some tax relief. They might even build them a road or a special exit. This is the kind of thing that is being done all the time, and it's generally done in the open. It's not under the table. Usually the city council or whatever the governing body locally is has to vote on these things. There have to be hearings, so it makes it very visible what the implications. And whereas a paving contract might happen every 15 years, depending on the quality and nature of the job, getting a new business could be, well, not forever, of course, but for decades. A lot of companies want to settle into a community. They want their employees to feel like they're part of that community. They want them to raise families there. So those are long-term involvements that have implications for the economy.
Let's talk about what you call the infrastructure deficit. Maybe it's not just your term. I mean, there's a concept out there of a technological debt, I guess, which is more about the internet. When you put off building websites and or updating them, you end up starting to things start to leak a little bit, and you build this up over time, and it becomes that much harder to pay off later in some respects. What are we experiencing in terms of an infrastructure deficit in this country?
Well, we do. That's right. If a road needs paving, but it's put off, it's what's called sometimes deferred maintenance. It just can get more and more expensive because you might have to, rip out so much of the old road and go down, to a foundation to do the job right. Whereas if you can resurface the road, even though to the layperson's eye it doesn't need anything but a little patch here and there, if you can do that in a timely fashion, in the long run you might save quite a bit of money. The trick there are several tricks, of course. How do you know when exactly to go in and do this when it's essential, rather than somebody just hyping and saying, "Oh, we need to do this now," and then we go back to kickbacks and all that business. But if we're talking about honest brokers, then it's still not a totally 100% agreed upon process. There are different theories, there are different models, there are decisions to make. Should the road be surfaced in concrete or asphalt? Things like this are go into those decisions, and the weather in any given year can have severe, profound effects too, especially in northern states where winter can be pretty severe. You can't just put down pavements in the middle of winter when it's sub-freezing and expect them to come out of it in top shape. You have to, if you're going to do it, you have to take special care and put in extra effort. So many factors go into it that it's not easy to give a single answer, but the answer to your question, the simple answer is yes.
And we have, you point out, obviously, it's almost fundamental to your book that the American Society of Civil Engineers, which I believe you're a member of, has given the American roads and bridges a grade of D and C plus, respectively. How dangerous is that in the short term? In other words, should we be worried as we cross a bridge, or are we not quite there yet?
Well, the bridges that we should worry about are generally those that are posted, as they say, that there's a sign telling you that, don't cross it if your vehicle weighs more than this amount. And most people, that'll accommodate most cars usually. The problem is it's very difficult. I think there are 600,000 bridges in this country. And I think something like about 60,000, about 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 is in this category where they need help by the ASCE's criteria. But generally speaking, I don't think we have to worry about going over any bridges because it doesn't necessarily, those categorizations don't necessarily mean that the bridge is about to fall down. The ASCE gives poor grades not only for condition of a bridge structurally, but also for the capacity of it. If a certain area needs, let's say, a 2-lane bridge, it only has a 1-lane bridge, well, that's going to earn a bad grade, a poor grade. Now, of course, you could say there are these examples. We just had an example in Atlanta where
Right.
A bridge collapsed. That bridge probably wasn't marked for any caution. That probably was in pretty good shape, that bridge. But this was what we could call, an external force that attacked the bridge, a fire that apparently, I haven't seen all the reports yet, but apparently there was a fire set, whether it was malicious or accidental. The fire did so much damage that the bridge has to be rebuilt. So the interstate highway section is going to be closed probably for many weeks, if not months. That's going to affect the economy in
Right.
Atlanta in big ways. I was just reading one nearby company is going to change its shift from daytime to nighttime so that they can use the roads when they're not so heavily traveled. So it's going to have profound effects on not only the economy, but also the quality of life of the people involved in that city. And who knows how many? I mean, Atlanta's a big city.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a shame. And of course, we had about 7 years ago the bridge across the Mississippi River on Interstate 35 up in Minneapolis.
Right.
Certainly. Now, that was an interesting example. There was a bridge that was standing for probably 40 years, if I recall correctly, not having any problems, and suddenly it collapsed. What happened? It didn't have signs saying, "Be careful, this is a dangerous bridge." Well, that bridge apparently was not inspected properly. There's a law in this country. Well, a law. It's enforced by the government. You don't get money unless you inspect your bridges every 2 years for bridges on state highways like interstates and other highways that are financed at least in part by the federal government. And apparently in this case in Minneapolis, the inspections were not as careful as they should have been, and the signs of danger were either overlooked or not understood or not reported. Exactly what category is correct, could be the subject of lawsuits. Lawsuits are often preempted by settlements. These things become difficult to interpret.
Right. Well, I mean, is this? I mean, are these functions that could be fulfilled by private industry? I mean, we spoke about early on, and I think there was a sort of a glancing reference to what we vaguely know, to the extent that there's really been this has been in any way sort of genuinely considered. But we vaguely know the broad strokes of the Trump infrastructure plan was basically to effectively privatize a lot of these public infrastructure works, providing loans and giving away any of the sort of the future revenue that might be derived from some of these infrastructure projects. But of course, the problem is that when you talk about, saying an infrastructure makes a lot more sense in that context than saying public works, because the fundamental difference, it seems to me, is that the reason why we need a federal government, and frankly, on some level a state government on a smaller level, to do these things is because they're not necessarily all profit making. That the profit incentive is not necessarily there as much as it is a quality of life, a cohesiveness of society, and whatnot. Is it possible to imagine these type of big projects actually being taken care of by private industry?
Well, if done correctly, yes. But of course, what does private mean? What does the private investor want? A private investor wants a return on investment, and how does that return on investment come out of a piece of infrastructure, whether it be a bridge or a road?
And we should say, in that scenario, both in the Indiana scenario, not only do the taxpayers end up having to pay for that road, it devalues the value of all the property alongside that road. I mean, if there are homes, let's say, or whatnot, I would imagine, when you have all these trucks going by. And the flip side, too, of, at the end of that 50-year lease, when the timing has been for these private companies to basically, we're going to build a road that's going to last 50 years. Well, after 50 years, there's a lot of people who've come to rely on the existence of that road. So the state is compelled to pick up the pieces, I would imagine, at that point.
Very well said. Yes, exactly.
Well, let's, lastly, give us a sense of like where we go from here on these questions, because it seems like there has been an ongoing understanding that we need to reinvest in our public works, broadly speaking, right? I mean, and in this case, we're just talking about the roads, but we see this in the context of plumbing and of going into homes around the country. I mean, we see this in multiple areas, airports. I mean, where do we go from here? Do we need to reach a crisis point, or what?
Well, very often a crisis point wakes people up, or shakes people off dead center, where they're just talking about it and debating it. It often does take that to make a significant change in the standard everyday way of doing things. And you say we have to invest. Who are we? Well, the government are we the government? Is the government we? It gets almost, it starts making your head hurt if you try to think this through sometimes. Ultimately, we pay taxes. We, the individuals, pay taxes to this entity known as the government, which represents us, or should represent us fairly, through watching the contracts for these roads and bridge projects and others, pipes, as you say, so that the graft and corruption doesn't make our money go not quite as far. Let's say. There's increasing talk, and I think this is what's ultimately going to happen. And when I say ultimately, I think perhaps within the decade, within a decade, we're going to see increasing user fees. Instead of gas taxes at the pump, we're going to see charges for how much mileage you drive in your vehicle, because that's what correlates with how much damage you're doing to roads and bridges. They're experimenting with this in a state like Oregon, for example, right now. And it gets pretty sophisticated. You only get taxed or charged, if you don't want to use the word tax, but it's really a user tax for the miles you drive in Oregon, in that state. So that's one thing that's probably going to happen, because the politicians in Washington, they don't want to raise the tax on gasoline, even though everybody agrees, I think, that that's needed. So, and of course, the reason that politicians don't want to, because it's a very visible vote that their opponent can use against them the next time their reelection comes up. And the same thing is a similar thing happens in the States. And we're going to see increasing tolls on interstates, I believe. I think we're going to end up paying for more and more. I know in my own town, it didn't used to be the case that we paid a sewer tax, but of the enormous proportions that we do today. So the local government, in order to keep up with things, just keeps increasing the cost of living for the people, the individuals, the individual homeowners, the individual water users, the individual utility users. There's going to be a breaking point. What it is, I don't exactly know, but it can't continue to go like this. We can't continue to just raise taxes. There's 100% is 100%, and when we reach 100%, they got everything, we got nothing, and we can't live that way. So what is that? That's why I think this public-private partnership is considered so important as an alternative. In the 19th century, the railroads, invested a lot of their own money because they would recapture their investment through the fares they charged people. Bridges were built as toll bridges, and they were seen as investments, private investments. The Brooklyn Bridge started out as a private investment, and it was going to, pay back its investors through tolls. And often these were very, very profitable investments. There's still a bridge that connects Canada with the U.S. up in Michigan across the Detroit River, called the Ambassador Bridge. It was once the longest suspension bridge in the world. It's a major bridge. It was built with private money, and it wants to expand because traffic is expanding up there. But the federal government is working at cross purposes to it. If you listen to the private investors side of it. And, do we really need a second bridge that the federal government, excuse me, not the federal government, but the state of Michigan and the province of, I think it's Ontario. The old models are coming back, but they're meeting a lot of opposition because we've gotten so used to this concept of public works and public investment.
I mean, it also, to be fair, when you talk about railroads in the 19th century, it led to a lot of disparity and a period of tremendous wealth inequality, and I think probably also a political inequality. So I guess there's caveats to be had on both sides of it. I mean, I happen to be of the school of seeing a lot of. I mean, our tax rates aren't nearly what they were back in the heyday of. They aren't nearly what they were during Eisenhower's period. When you talk about the top tier tax rates and also in terms of corporate taxes, not to mention there's also a theory out there that when you have control over your own money supply, that taxation isn't as crucial as I think we're led to believe. But nevertheless, all of these issues are going to have to be worked out in one form or another going forward. Henry Petroski, the book is The Road Taken, The History and the Future of America's Infrastructure. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed talking with you.